All right. Well, welcome to Raymore Live. We're just a little bit late starting today. We had a little technical glitch and had to clear it up. So I hope we didn't lose everybody wondering what had happened. But we are on today and we're carrying on with our program following up on last week. We're looking at the American founding Christian era. And last week we looked at the Jamestown story, and this week we're going to look at the Pilgrims. And it's appropriate that we look at the Pilgrims because this is the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, which is the 22nd of November. And I've always loved the Pilgrims. It's been one of my favorite stories in American history. Even going back to my childhood, I was always intrigued by them. And so I'm glad to be able to do a Raymore Live program on it. This will be the first time I've done anything like this, even though I've spoken about them in sermons and interviews and things, but this is the first time we've done a program. So here we go. And we're looking at the Pilgrims, Pilgrim Fathers, and the landing at Plymouth, Massachusetts in November 11, I believe it was, 1620. Pretty momentous time in American history. And we're looking at the theme of the Christian founding of America. I have long believed that we have strong Christian origins. Now, we're not a Christian nation now and probably haven't been for quite some time. It's been a gradual devolution away from our Christian roots. And those Christian roots and origins really carried on really up through the revolutionary and constitutional era. And sometime next year, I think I want to have a program about a debate I had in October 2009 with a famous atheist at the University of South Carolina on the topic, is America a Christian nation? We actually debated that, and I got quite a bit of publicity in both the Christian and the secular world about it. But we're not going to talk about that today. We're going to look at the origins of our country, looking at their Christian origins, particularly at the Pilgrims. So the first thing we want to look at is the life of the Pilgrims before the Mayflower, and who were these people, and what happened to them, and what caused them to even come to America in the first place. So, Jared, if you can post that, life of the Pilgrims before the Mayflower. Here they are, praying on the deck of the ship, the Mayflower, as they're coming to America. Let's scroll down a little bit and examine who these people were. All right, they were Christians, evangelical Christians in the Puritan tradition. They were Puritans, but they were also separatists. If you know anything about the Puritans, they had a Reformed or Puritan theology, but they stayed within the Anglican Church. They did not separate from the Anglican Church when King James was King of England. And so the Pilgrims were separatists. They did not want to stay under the governance of the Anglican Church. And so as a result, they were really harassed and they were in some danger. And they were living in Scrooby, England, led by William Brewster. A group of them set sail for Amsterdam in 1607, and they live in Leiden, where they found complete religious liberty, but it wasn't their culture. And so after a few years, they realized that they were losing their English distinctives, and that their children were becoming more Dutch than they were English. And so they felt like they needed to do something different. They were living in Holland and they had a better life. They had religious freedom, but they were not happy with the culture. Okay, let's scroll on down a little bit. We won't spend a long time on that, but a group of them got together and they came back to England around 1620, and they decided to set sail for the New World. They got permission to go to Virginia. As we looked at last week, there was already a settlement of Puritans and low church Anglicans in Virginia. and they had settled there beginning in 1607. And by 1620, that settlement was pretty well permanent, had made it, and they were going to come and had permission to settle in Virginia, in northern Virginia. All right, so they boarded the ship, the Mayflower, and headed for the New World. All right, let's see, go on. Let's look at the next slide, Mayflower and Mayflower Compact. So here they are and this is a picture of a replica of the Mayflower, which is a ship that they came over on. And there were actually 102 pilgrims in the party. And some of them were not part of the congregation. They were deckhands. They had to have crew, and of course the pilgrims were not sailors, so there was a crew that went along as well. And so they set sail, I think, in July for Virginia. And as they were coming in toward the coast, they were blown off course, terrible storms, and they lost their bearings, and they landed in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, thinking they were going to be in Virginia, but they were quite a ways to the north. All right, let's go on down. And so the ship docked at Cape Cod, which is near the town of Provincetown today, and they named it Plymouth. And let's see, go on down a little bit more. And in November 1620, and one of the first things they did was they signed the Mayflower Compact. And this was a very important document. All right, let's go on quickly going down about the ship and the people. Now, this was a Christian group in the Puritan theological tradition, but they were not part of the Anglican Church. They were separated from the Anglican Church. At this particular time in their life, they referred to themselves as simply saints, and it was only some years later they became known as the Pilgrims, which is a name that they've been have stuck with them down through the centuries. All right, let's see more about the ship there. There's a picture of the ship. This now, of course, is a replica. This is not the original Mayflower, but it's a pretty good replica. And all right, let's go further. And now this is a stop here. They drew up a covenant or compact right after they landed, actually before they got off the ship. And 41 of the men, pilgrim males, signed the compact. And this is is looked upon as a very important historic document in American history. We know from our previous broadcast that the Charter of 1606 was also an explicit Christian document, and that was given by King James I. And it said that the early settlers at Jamestown had come from the glory of God. They had arrived on these shores. The first English settlers arrived on these shores in North America for the glory of God and for the propagation of the Christian faith. And so they were clearly in their minds setting up a Christian nation. Okay, let's go a little more. Okay. Let's look at the compact real briefly. All right, here they are, a picture of them signing the compact. Now, of course, this is obviously a painting of some kind. And they're on the deck of the ship. 41 signed the compact. And in 1802, John Quincy Adams, who is actually a descendant from one of the Pilgrims, said this agreement is the only instance in American history of a positive original social compact and is believed to have influenced the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. That's John Quincy Adams, one of our presidents, making this statement. Let's look at the compact real quick, and we won't spend a long time on this, but this is very similar to the Charter of 1606 at Jamestown. And they came with permission of King James by the grace of God, and they honor the king. And then they said, having undertaken for the glory of God and the advancement of the Christian faith in honor of our king and country, a voyage to plant the first colony in the northern parts of Virginia. Like I said, they were off course. They failed to reach Virginia, and they reached Cape Cod, Massachusetts instead. But they covenanted together to organize a civil body politic, which means this was a self-governing local group. And this is the first time in world history that this came from a self-governing group, not from a prince, a king, or a lord, or an emperor. And this is a very unique document, even, and it was done by very simple, ordinary people. All right, let's move now. They've landed, and they set up a colony, and we'll talk a little bit about some of the difficulties they had. But let's look at some images, modern images of Plymouth Plantation, what it may have looked like. And I think there was an effort. This is the way it looks today. If you go there on a tour or vacation, you'll see these sites. And this is the way the colony looked after a few years, when they had time to build houses and a local congregation. This was kind of what the modern people imagined that Plymouth looked like after a few years. Had lived in England and was a convert to Christianity. Pretty amazing, almost an impossible thing that it could happen. And of course, it takes us to the doctrine or the teaching of providence. Providence simply means that God is working all things to the purposes of his own will. Romans 8:28 is a very good text in the New Testament on divine providence, that God causes all things to work to his will and according to the blessings of his people. And so they were being divinely protected and allowed to stay there when, humanly speaking, it was impossible. We're offering this book, Squanto. If you're interested, you could order it from us for a donation of $15. And my wife and I have had a custom, one of our family traditions. We always read it to our grandchildren at Thanksgiving vacation. And my kids always wait for me to tell the Squanto story during our Thanksgiving meal. And these are the kind of traditions that you can create for your children growing up, having a teaching or belief in God's providence, working in the lives of his people to protect them and care for them and to bring about his desired purposes. Okay, let's move on and look at the first Thanksgiving celebration. Paul Jaley, Reverend Paul Jaley, who is a friend of mine, there he is. He pastors a church in Plymouth called New Testament Church. And he's also the director of the Plymouth Rock Foundation, which is based there. And it's a ministry or foundation geared towards celebrating the Pilgrim story. And he's one of the most knowledgeable historians in America on the Pilgrims. And he happens to be a direct descendant from one of the Pilgrim Fathers who landed in the first landing, Thomas Rogers. Thomas Rogers died the first year because of the weather and the health issues, but his family and children survived. And Dr. Paul Jaley is actually descended from an original Pilgrim Father, Thomas Rogers, who signed the Mayflower Compact. He lives there. He's dedicated, as a pastor of a church, has a Christian school. He's a big homeschool supporter and speaks a lot at homeschool conventions around New England. And he conducts a lot of tours of the area there. And of course, you know, the National Park Service runs a tour service, but they tend to minimize the Christian history. You know, we're going through a period of revisionism of our American history, particularly the Christian part of it, and a deconstruction of that history. And so Paul is right there in town, and he does tours and provides the corrected version of the Christian version of American history to offset the secularized brand that's put out by the National Park Service. And I understand that same trend is going on all over the country where there's any kind of Christian history of any local service, even in the Philadelphia Convention where they have the Constitutional Convention. They've written some of the Christian history of that period out as well. So Paul is there to contest it, and we're real proud of him. And it's Dr. Paul Jaley. And if you ever get up to Plymouth, we urge you to go to his tour and let him give you the uncensored version of America's Christian heritage with the Pilgrims at Plymouth. All right, let's see. Let's go and look at the first clip on him. He talks about let's see. We're looking at the monument that was erected in 1989 to honor the Pilgrims, and this was created to sort of be a marker for the Christian version of the Pilgrims. Let's play that. It's only 1 minute. We'll actually play it on the program this morning.
The National Monument to the Forefathers, the largest granite monument in the United States, was dedicated in 1889 to honor the English settlers who landed in Plymouth, Massachusetts. The monument's dedication reads, "Erected by a grateful people in remembrance of their labors, sacrifices, and sufferings for the cause of civil and religious liberty." The monument, 181 feet tall, features several figures depicting virtues the Pilgrims brought to America in 1620. The largest figure, Faith, is 36 feet tall and weighs 180 tons. The monument also features depictions of morality, law, education, and liberty.
Okay. This monument was erected in 1989 and it's sort of a marker for our nation. And I think they didn't say this, but in some ways, it would be a shrine that if we lost our way as a nation, as a Christian nation, we could come back to this monument and study it and find our way. And of course, there they had the four planks were morality, law, education, and I forget what the fourth one was, but education was part of it, and they understood liberty. Yeah, Christian education was a very important part of what the Pilgrims were doing, and we're going to hit on that toward the end of this program. And so even the famous actor Kirk Cameron has created a special DVD series to commemorate that. We can just put that up real quick, and it's been out a few years. Here's Paul Jaley giving a lecture at the monument, and we'll just show him doing that real briefly. We won't look at the whole thing. Can you play that?
Of our dread sovereign King James, and he was dreadful. But the idea was they went from God to the people and then to the government. That was unheard of. The documents went from God to the king, to the people. That was reversed in the Mayflower Compact.
Okay, there we go. We'll stop there. So he's explaining the Mayflower Compact. That was a unique document that was originated from the people, not the king. And this is, of course, our Constitution and our Declaration follow that model. Now, Paul here is, like I said, a direct descendant from Thomas Rogers, who was one of the original Pilgrims, and he died the first year, but his family and children lived on. And so we're real happy to put that up. And now we'll go quickly to Kirk Cameron and show this. There it is. He's a great actor, you know, and a homeschool father, and has been in a lot of Christian movies. And he created this movie along with Marshall Foster, who is a great Christian historian in America as well. And I think you may still be able to get this. I know it's been out 5 or 6 years, but this is a movie called Monumental, and it talks about this monument that was built in 1889 to commemorate the Christian character and aspects of the Pilgrim Landing. And I understand that it's almost invisible today. If you're on a National Park Service tour guide, they don't dare take you to this monument. And many people come there to study the Pilgrims, and they don't even know this exists. And let's just pray they don't take a sledgehammer and tear it down like they're trying to do with so many of our monuments now. So we have to fight to protect our history. And this was created, like I said, in 1889 to make a permanent shrine to describe what the Pilgrims were about and what their arguments and issues were. All right, let's move on to, let's see. What was our next item here, Jared? Okay, great. Now, this is a nice little touch that I'm going to give you here, and I've got a personal aspect to it. My pastor, he's Dr. Mike Galdamez, pastors the church my wife and I are members of, and we attended a party, graduation party for one of his children, 4 or 5 months ago now. And he graduated homeschool all the way through the 12th grade. And so mom and dad had a nice drop in. And so all the people in the church showed up, and it was a nice affair for their son, Hudson. And so I'm visiting with Pastor Mike's mom and dad, who had come to be part of the celebration from Oklahoma. I just enjoy telling this story, and you'll see why when we get to the point. And so you might have guessed by watching our Raymore Live program from time to time that I'm kind of a history trivia nut. I just love little stories of history and how history, particularly God's providential history, how God works in history and things that he does that seem almost minor and small, but they end up being pretty big. And so I'm talking about some of my family stories and my wife's family story. She comes from a very historical South Carolina family, the Pinckney family. And excuse me for mentioning it, but 2 of the Pinckneys signed the U.S. Constitution from Charleston. So we're talking about that. And so Pastor Mike's mother just sort of blurts it out. She says, well, I'm descended from John Alden. And I guess she figured I wouldn't have any idea who that was. I said, you're kidding. John Alden of the Mayflower? And she looked at me like, wow, he does know who that is. And so we started talking about John Alden of the Mayflower. And John Alden was a Cooper. That's C-O-O-P-E-R. He was not part of the original separatist group. He was like a crew hand and was hired on to work the ship. And his job was to take care of the barrels. In those days, they didn't have glass containers, and they couldn't drink water because it was always question of its being contaminated. So they had barrels of beer. Yes, everybody drank beer in those days because it was the only way you could get hydration without getting sick. And even, I guess, the children had to drink the beer. And so John Alden came aboard, and he worked the crew, was one of the crew. And somewhere along the line, he may have already been a Christian. We don't know for sure, but he was one of the signers of the Mayflower Compact. And so he came as a crew, and he seemed to have joined the congregation at some point and become part of the believing group. And so when the ship ended up going back to England, he stayed. And the legend is that he was the first man to step on the new continent. He was the first man off off the Mayflower to land on Plymouth Rock, the very first man to land on the shore. And so he would. Priscilla Mullins was one of the Pilgrim families, and the first winter, her mother and father died, and her brother. She was the only survivor of that family, and so she was 18 years old, and one of the few, maybe in the only available single female who could marriage age. And so during that period, Miles Standish, who was the captain of the military unit, and John Alden was also part of the military unit. They had to have a little military group to protect them from any danger, and particularly if the Native Americans proved not to be friendly. And so he lost his wife. She passed away in that first winter. And so he was a very shy man, and he needed someone to be a go-between. So he talked John Alden into being his go-between to write love letters to Priscilla Mullins and to kind of court her on his behalf. And he stayed at a distance. Well, at some point along the way, Priscilla Mullins finally said to John Alden, when he was speaking on behalf of his friends, Miles Standish, "Speak for yourself, John." And what had happened is they had fallen in love. And so they ended up getting married, not Miles Standish. And let's flip down to the poem, The Courtship of Miles Standish. Do you have that up there? Okay, yeah. This is a famous poem in American history written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow called The Courtship of Miles Standish. And actually, Henry Wadsworth Longfellow is a direct descendant from John Alden and Priscilla Mullins. And you might find it also interesting that John Adams, the second president of the United States, and his son John Quincy Adams were direct descendants of John Alden and Priscilla Mullins, as is my own pastor, Mike Galdamez, and of course his children. And I have to say, I had the great privilege of explaining this story in some detail to his three children. And they knew about it a little bit, but not much. So I was able to fill them in and being the historical trivia nut that I am. But anyway, I understand today there may be several million descendants from this marriage. This is the first romance in the New World among English-speaking people. And maybe there was something comparable to it in Jamestown between Pocahontas and John Rolfe, and then maybe some others that came over later. But this is the first one, certainly in Plymouth. So anyway, I thought that was a very interesting touch, and you can look it up on the internet as well. All right, let's see. We've got one more thing that we want to look at, and this will be what we'll conclude with today. All right, go to why the Pilgrims really came to America. All right, great. This is such a wonderful article. I think this is so good, and it really caps off everything that we're talking about today and summarizes the really important aspects of the Pilgrim landing as much as anything I've seen, by Angie Mosteller, and it was published on Crosswalk in 2013. And it's just an incredible article. And I ask you, if you are more interested in more information, contact the office and we can send this to you, or you could actually Google it and look it up yourself. And here it is, Why the Pilgrims Really Came to America by Angie Mosteller. And it was published on crosswalk.com. And I believe it was November 21, 2013. I've read it many times and I refer to it quite a bit. The general feeling is that they came to America for religious liberty. And that is sort of true. They fled England and went to Leiden, Holland for a number of years and found religious liberty there. But the culture there was more libertine than they were used to, and it was influencing their lifestyle and their culture in a negative way. And so they really came to America as much for the sake of their children as they did for religious liberty. And this story, this aspect of the Pilgrims is not as well known, but it really fits clearly and to the mission really of the Exodus mandate. You know, we have a ministry to try to grow homeschooling and Christian schooling. And we believe the scripture commands that children to be raised in the fear and admonition of the Lord, and they're to be instructed in Christian way of life. And the only way to really do that today successfully and according to God's standards is through private Christian schooling or homeschooling, not through public schooling. Now, I don't know that those issues were so clear in 1620, but it was clear to the Pilgrims that they were losing their children. And this is written up in William Bradford's book of Plymouth Plantation. And this quote is actually from that book. And the only work available to these immigrants, these Pilgrim immigrants living in Holland between 1607 and 1620, was that many of them had to join the military, and they were working in jobs that were causing them to abandon their parents' values. And so William Bradford actually said this. I'm going to read it as best I can. It's a little bit of the Old English. And it says, of all the sorrows most heavy to be borne by the Pilgrims in Holland was that many of their children were influenced by the conditions, and they were becoming licentious, like the other children, the people of the country. And many temptations were overtaking their children, and they were led by evil examples into dangerous courses, getting the reins off the necks that their parents had. Some became soldiers. Well, I didn't know that was a bad thing. I was a soldier in the Army Reserve for 30 years, but it might have been a bad thing in that time. Some became soldiers. Others embarked upon voyages to sea. They meant they became seafarers and had to work in that industry. And others upon worse courses, tending to dissoluteness and danger to their souls, to the great grief of their parents and the dishonor of God. So they saw their posterity were in danger to degenerate and become corrupt. That's why they came to America. They came to save their children. And that's what we're about in the Exodus Mandate. We're seeking to try to separate ourselves from pagan, godless, and demonic education and save our children through godly living in our families and also for Christian education in our homes. You could say, my friends, that America was founded and indirectly based on a desire for Christian education of children. That's why they came. That's why we are founded as a nation. And I'd like to put forth the idea that we can be refounded and reconstituted and renewed and reinvigorated by the same mission if we can discover and rediscover what the Pilgrims understood of the importance of raising their children in the Christian faith. That's what they were all about. That's why they came. And you see the picture of them here, praying to God, dedicating the land after they landed. It's a moving picture, isn't it? And they weren't stopped because the first winter, half of them died. No, they stayed at it. They stayed with it. And I'm glad they did. They gave us a Christian nation. They gave us a Christian heritage. And these were not the elite of the day. These were the ordinary Christian people. Now, they did have some scholars among them. Brewster, John Robinson, their pastor, he was a Cambridge trained man. They were mostly ordinary people. As I said, John Alden was a cooper. He was a barrel. Now, that was a pretty big job in those days because you had to have you had to have beer to be able to be hydrated. and it was his job to keep those barrels in good shape. We don't need barrels today for our drinking water or anything, but that was a big job in 1620. And now let's look at a second reason for the Pilgrims coming to America. This is almost as touching. And this is the same thing that the Jamestown people felt when they came in 1607. And this is a direct quote from William Bradford. I can hardly read this without getting choked up, actually. Here were ordinary, simple little people, not great, mighty people. And he says about the Pilgrims, this is William Bradford now. He was a second governor of Plymouth Colony. He wrote the famous book Of Plymouth Plantation. And he said they, that is the Pilgrims, cherished a great hope and inward zeal of laying good foundations, or at least of making some way towards it, for the propagation and advance of the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in the remote parts of the world, even though they should be but a stepping stone to others in the performance of so great a work. So they saw what they were doing was part of evangelization, and they did have a heart. This is the Jamestown people did for the evangelization of the Native Americans. And we do know for 50 years it was a treaty between the Pilgrims and the local tribe of Massasoit and Somerset. And tragically, in 1575, war broke out between the settlers 50 years later, the Puritans and the Pilgrims, between the tribal people. And it was a real tragedy, and we won't get into that today. But for 50 years, they had harmony and peace, and they spoke and evangelized and tried to reach the tribes for Christ. And as we looked at the first Thanksgiving celebration, we didn't get a chance to put that up, actually. The Native Americans joined in with the first Thanksgiving celebration, and Paul Jaley talks about that. And it wasn't just a afternoon of turkey and ham; it was actually days of celebration, and there was great harmony between the Native Americans of the Indian population and the Pilgrims for 50 years. And so their sacrifice, they came for the sake of their children and for the gospel and for the evangelization of the world. And they made a historic decision to immigrate to America and became, as a result, our founders. And this country, to some degree, maintained its greatness because it followed the traditions that these early settlers put forth, both the Jamestown colony and the colony at Plymouth. Okay, we'll stop at that point, and we've got 10 minutes left, and maybe we can get a discussion going, and maybe my comments today might have generated some questions.
Ray, this is a great show. Thank you so much.
Okay.
I was wondering if there is a difference at all in the religion of the Virginia settlers and the Puritans. Were the Virginia ones Anglican?
Yeah, they were. There's no difference in the theology.
Right.
The Puritans were Anglican. That meant they were denominationally Anglican, but they held to Puritan theology, which was a kind of a reform version of evangelicalism. But the Pilgrims were Anglican or Puritan in doctrine and theology, but they were denominationally separatists. They broke away from the Anglican Church and didn't want to be under its governance. So they were different denominationally, you might say, but the same theologically. And so in 1630, John Winthrop came over with a Puritan group, and he made that famous statement. It was 10 years later that the new nation that they were founding, and they landed, I think, in Boston, and they said he was the one that made the famous statement. I think it goes actually back to Augustine, originally said it, that we're going to be a city set on a hill. And that's a great scriptural concept, that this nation is going to be a light unto the world. and that's what they set out to do. They set out to create a Christian nation. Now, over decades, the Pilgrims were a much smaller colony, and they were sort of subsumed into the Puritans, because when the Puritans came over in 1630, I think thousands of them came, and forget the name of the ship and all, but they were a larger body, and the Pilgrims, they had a theological common ground, but they were denominationally separate. So after a period of time, the Pilgrims sort of lost their identity, and then the Puritans that landed in New England, eventually they ended up separating from the Anglican Church too, and they became Congregationalists,